Welcome into the Irish NFL show, reviewing all the NFC divisions. In this episode, we're going to review the NFC North. I'm delighted to have Colin Cronin, Conor Brophy with me to discuss this division. And this one is, I suppose, to Conor's heart because it is the division in which his favourite team, his beloved Chicago Bears, are a part of. And we're going to start there, Conor. Why not? Let's start with the Chicago Bears. I was running through the free agency acquisitions today, and I gave up trying to remember them all because there's been so many and some really strong players that were brought in, a real aggressive nature to Paul's tenure this year in terms of GM. Opening day of free agency really went in gung-ho to bring a lot of players in. And I suppose the Bears have a lot of positions of needs, and obviously then Justin Fields as well as obviously the question mark in terms of where he is in his development. I'll hand it over to you because you are our Bears fan here. So where are you standing within the polls there so far?
Where to start, as you say, I have a lot of skin in the game here and a lot of opinions to share. So I'll try and summarize it nicely. But I mean, the Bears were the NFC North Benevolent Society last year. Let's not forget that. The only team in the NFL not to win a single divisional game, like handed out all 6 wins to other teams in the division. Like, let's not forget that the Bears had the worst record in the NFL. They got the number 1 pick for a reason. They kind of quiet tanked in a funny way. You know, they sort of self-destructed on the defensive side of the ball, you know, handing away Robert Quinn, you know, trading players through the season, you know, clearly signaling that they were breaking it down and starting again. And that had problems on the other side of the ball then. So they just couldn't play complementary football. And although they were competitive in a lot of the games they lost, they still lost 10 in a row. And it was a pretty unwatchable stretch at times, punctuated obviously by the brilliance of Justin Fields, particularly with his legs. We need to see a lot more of him using the arm, obviously, this year, and that's the big thing. If Ryan Poles is kind of trying to flatter the Eagles by comparison, you know, imitation being the most sincere form of flattery, you know, if you squint a little bit, you can kind of see it starting to take shape, and that clearly he's building through the trenches. Bears added some monsters on both sides of the ball, both in free agency and through the draft. Excited to see how Darnell Wright does. You know, obviously during the offseason, you start looking at the tape and you're imagining, oh, these definite starters. These guys are definitely going to tear it up when they hit the field. And let's hope that turns out to be the case. Also hoping that that Fields will take the Jalen Hurts-like step that he did at a similar stage of his career in Philadelphia. But if not, and this is why I like what they did around and what Post did around the number 1 pick, trading with Carolina, getting DJ Moore when there just weren't a lot of, you know, top level receivers available, and managing to land a guy like that, you know, put that weapon out there for Justin Fields, and still have the capital for next year, given what they acquired in return, that they can take another swing at it if this doesn't turn out to be the year for Justin Fields and he doesn't make the breakthrough on top of the breakthrough that he made last year. And I'm not dismissing that, but you know, you're not going to win with a quarterback who, whatever the brilliance with his legs, he has to be more than a running threat. He has to be a genuine dual threat. Otherwise, they're going to be in the market for one of the exciting players that we've seen in 2024. You know, I'd love to see Fields succeed. Don't get me wrong. And you're getting the OTA reports that himself and DJ Moore have struck up that relationship and that they're flying and training. I know we'll get to the NFC East at some point, and you're hearing similar things about Daniel Jones and Darren Waller in New York, and that might be quickly forgotten when the season starts and reality intervenes. But look, so far so good. Do I expect the Bears to challenge for the NFC North title or to make the playoffs this year? Bluntly, no, I don't. I don't see a Jacksonville Jaguars like resurgence. It's just too big a climb from where they were. There's a massive rebuilding job. That's foundations have definitely been laid, but I think this year is a year of progress, not a year where I expect them to be anywhere near the playoffs.
Where do you stand on Justin Fields as a whole? Because there's a lot of Bears fans who I know that you can't even get into that conversation with them. They're just so bought into Justin Fields. We had a live show in January in Captain America's, and that came up as in the nature of the show, and some of the questions, and the Bears fans in the audience were, no. It's the problem is the fact that he hasn't got any functional players around him. The offensive line was so poor, but there was games in the fourth quarter last year, as you touched on. They lost a lot of close games where when the speed of the game play, you know, kind of sped up and he was in a position to go down and drive down to win the games. He couldn't do it. Is that a part of the steep learning curve he's experiencing as a quarterback, or is it because of what was around him?
Yeah, well, kind of all of the above, Brian, for me. Like, you can't judge a quarterback without judging the situation. We've seen that time and time again. Guys who've been written off, who just happen to be in a terrible situation, can be the guy when they're in a good situation. Ryan Tannehill probably being one outstanding example. Geno Smith, who we talked about in the NFC West preview, probably being another one. And you can't judge Fields without looking at the awful situation he was in last year with a non-functioning offensive line with nobody to throw to half the time. Now, against that, there were times where he still did the things that you expect a second-year quarterback to do, unfortunately, hanging onto the ball too long. He was the most sacked quarterback in the NFL, partly because of the offensive line, partly because he held onto the ball too long. Had some bad turnovers. Ball security was a bit of an issue in terms of, coughing it up when he was hit, but then he was hit an awful lot as well. So that's not all on him. We can't judge him properly until we see what he has around him this year. But what he has around him this year is an awful lot better than what he had last year. It's certainly projecting to be an awful lot better. So there's I think we're removing the excuses, bluntly. It's up to him to perform. Like I say, I'm still excited by what I've seen, and I still think there's a lot of upside. It was all about what an amazing runner he was, what a transcendent player with ball in hand taken off, and the highlight reel is amazing, and there were some good throws as well. But you'd like to see that Ohio State pocket passer that we saw, light up college football, transfer to the NFL, and we haven't seen that yet. And unless we do next year, I suspect Ryan Poles will be quick enough to move on and won't be sentimental. Again, back to where we started, perhaps modeling himself on what Howie Roseman had to do in Philadelphia, moving on from Carson Wentz when it was clear that he wasn't going to be the person to take them to the promised land.
Colin, it's a fair reflection. Where are you standing on the Bears? And I know you always kind of preach that if it's not the quarterback, you move on quickly, and you move on quickly. I'm sorry, you move on, you take your bumps in the road. And the Bears have stockpiled really well with the Panthers trade for next season. So even if it's a two-way street here. If they are successful this season, they can only improve on the season that's ahead of them, or they have to reconvene in terms of the quarterback situation. You're in on Justin Fields, I imagine, and the way you were with Jalen Hurts, yeah.
I am. I'm not as high on Fields as I was on Hurts. I really truly believe Hurts is just his leadership ability and his character were so evident. When you saw that interview after the championship game, right, when he got pulled at halftime, and you saw the kid interviewed, I was in awe from that moment. I knew he was going to be a superstar because guys respond to that. When you saw him wish nothing but the best for his teammate who had just come into the game and won it, and just celebrate, like it was so obvious, right? So anyway, Park, Jalen Hurts, Justin Fields. I'm high on him because I think he can do it, and I think when we spoke to Matt Verderam, who has been around the game a long time, and I would respect his opinion. He talked about how talent plays obviously the most important part, but luck and landing spot are so important, right? Because and he went with Patrick Mahomes. What if Patrick Mahomes had ended up in Chicago? Would he be a fantastic player? Yes, he would. But would he be Patrick Mahomes, the transcendent talent who has the potential to be the greatest quarterback we have potentially ever seen in the NFL? No, he wouldn't, because he wouldn't have Andy Reid, and he wouldn't have all the talent that he had with Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill that allowed him to develop, and the offensive line that they put in place. So it's so important that teams do try to, support and develop their young QBs. And teams, I think, are getting better at that and realizing what they need to invest in it. I think the Bears have done a job this offseason. Is it perfect? No. But is it much better than it was? Absolutely. Like last year, they rolled the dice, and it was probably a little too much that they paid for, say, Claypool. But Claypool can be WR3 now, and he's a decent WR3 to have. And when you kind of say Darnell Mooney, when you have DJ Moore, you've options there. So I expect them to take a step, but it's a big season for, I think, they need to show progress, but Justin Fields is the one who needs to show the most progress because they do have the ammunition if needs be. And remember, he is not their guy. He is not the guy for this GM. So they're going to get a kind of a pass on it if they decide to move on from Fields. they'll be able to say, he wasn't our guy, give us the opportunity to get our guy in and things will turn around. But I expect the Bears to be better than they were last year, albeit that's akin to winning a taller than Danny DeVito contest. Brian, you're on mute.
I'm back now. I was just reading off a list of players in which the Bears have taken in free agency. I'll start again. And they're all valid players because they were all really productive for the teams last year. Edwards for the Eagles, Edmonds from the Bills, Nate Davis, offensive guard from the Titans, DeMarcus Walker, Titans, defensive line, Travis Homer, interest from Seattle, Dante Forward, running back from the Panthers. And the list goes on. Robert Tonyan's one more I'll show in there. The reason I say is, and Connor, I'll just quickly finish with you on the Bears. There's so many good players that are brought in their own way who've been really good for their teams over the past few years that have, I suppose, found their way into free agency and got the contracts. But the Bears are likely could win a lot of games next year. May not make the playoffs, but be really competitive and get over the line in those games in which they lost this season, putting them in a bit of a quandary situation, because if they are a little bit unsure of the quarterback situation, they may have won a number of games to take themselves out of sweepstakes. And maybe that's where that Panthers number one pick will be vital, and the additional second round pick that they have the ammo to go up the board next year potentially. And again, I suppose they were the most aggressive movers in the sense they went back to 9 this year. It could be the other way around next year, and they could be moving up to 1 or 2.
Yeah, in a funny way, Brian, as you say, almost the worst result is that they end up in a kind of a 9-8 or miss the playoffs, 8-9 type scenario. You see a little bit of up and down from Fields, and you're not quite sure. And then, as you say, you're in the position where, do we use this capital to add 1 or 2 more weapons and hope that he's the guy, or you'd nearly be better off in a situation where it doesn't quite pan out for him. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about the offense, of course. Like, there are 2 things that you associate with Chicago football. It's smash mouth running game and defense. And we haven't talked about the defensive side of the ball at all. Eberflus is a defensive coach. The record in Indianapolis was putting teams on the field that weren't necessarily laden down with top tier talent, but producing solid defensive efforts every year, top 10 defensive efforts every year. The Bears obviously traded Roquan Smith last year, traded Robert Quinn, got rid of Khalil Mack in the offseason, so they were never going to be competitive on that side of the ball. The secondary, I think, was better than it played last year. You can't have a good looking secondary if you're not putting pressure on the passer at all. You're going to be put under all sorts of pressure, and no defensive backs in the world are going to be able to cope with what the Bears were facing last year, because they weren't getting any pressure on the passer from the front four at all, because they didn't have the players to do it. But I liked what I saw of Jaquan Brisker last year. I liked what I saw of Kyler Gordon. I think with what they've put in place this year, going to be a lot more competitive on that side of the ball. But again, we need to see something from Flus here and from the defensive side of the ball in terms of really making a big difference there. It's not all about talent. It's also about coaching. We talk about draft and develop as being the only sustainable path to success. And yet we're so high on who people draft and hitting on draft picks. What happens when you get those people in the building and how you develop them is what ultimately decides whether you're going to be a competitive football team. And that's another thing we've got to see this year from Chicago. And I'm hoping to see big improvement on what we saw last year, because that's what's going to keep them in games.
Kind of a final point on the Bears.
Yeah, just on the Bears and the piece that would probably concern me in terms of the defensive side of the ball. Then Connor touched on a lot of the points, but just in terms of the improvement, you have to have a pass rush. You have to have a pass rush in the NFL, and the Bears had 20 sacks last year, and they bottom of the pile. And it's tough to see, while the trenches have been reinforced, on the edge, it's difficult to see where the sacks are going to come from. And that is a piece that will be interesting. And I think where Eberflus is going to have to earn his money is finding a way to allow his players to get to the opposing QB, because sacks are, fundamental to changing the rhythm, to disrupting your opponent. And ultimately, that is something that the Bears are going to need to do. And so, again, we've talked about it, in some of the other podcasts, Brian, about the players that are still on the market. Could the Bears look to perhaps bring somebody in, particularly in that area? that might be something that they might look to do, or maybe Eberflus will look at other options and other ways to scheme up kind of pressure on opposing QBs. But that is a piece that they absolutely fundamentally have to improve on.
Still a bit of cap space as well to play with. I think Bears fans are quietly optimistic, I think, about the upcoming season. And we spent 15 minutes on the Bears, so I think it's fair we just move on to your teams. Colin, you're going to love this one because you're going next. It's the Packers. Aaron Rodgers, oh no, we can't speak about Aaron Rodgers anymore. He is no longer a Packers quarterback, and we don't have to discuss the saga anymore. But the saga is now handed over to Jordan Love in a sense. And I was looking at some of the players in which he's going to have at his disposal this year, and it's a really younger offense, particularly the wide receivers. Watson had a difficult start to the season. I wonder if Watson's career initially in the fourth season there would have been a lot better if he had made that catch in week 1 in which he dropped and Aaron Rodgers gave him that stare, because at the end of the season, when he got it right, he was a really explosive player. And they have Dobbs, who came on last year, and then this year they've drafted Reed in the second round, another wide receiver who's expected to start immediately. And they still got Aaron Jones in the backfield and an offensive line that is reasonably secure. So is it all bad? Like, people have little expectation right now for the Packers. Where do you see the Packers right now? Again, in the draft, they did what they always do. Just the Packers fans are chomping at the bit for an explosive player on offense. They don't go near an offensive player in the first round and continue the trend of a defensive player. Is it the defense that's going to put them in a position to win games next season, or is Jordan Love ready to make this big step up?
Well, whether Jordan Love is ready or not, the atmosphere in Green Bay and around Lambeau is going to be infinitely better. You said we can move on from Aaron Rodgers, so we can't, because Matt Steidman, who we've had on the show a number of times, at the day of that we're recording this, had a major story in The Athletic, and people should definitely check it out, where he talked to Rodgers. And my goodness, the divorce was a long time coming, which we all knew. I mean, we've talked about that on this show before, Brian. I think if the Packers had their time again, they would absolutely bite the Broncos' hands off for those 3 first-round picks. But when you hear about it and how unhappy things seem to be over the past couple of years, and kind of the pettiness and everything that went on, and don't get me wrong, it seemed Rodgers, there was an awful lot of pettiness on his side, but it feels like the team could have handled it. And Andrew Brandt was kind of tweeting today about how it demonstrates that the teams hold the power in the NFL, which is true. But ultimately, if you have a player who's fundamentally unhappy, what is the point in keeping that player around? What was gained by the Packers by keeping Aaron Rodgers around last year? So I think it will be very, very, very interesting to see. He looks like a new person in the Jets, and when we do our AFC, off-season review, we can talk about that. But to me, the atmosphere is ultimately going to be infinitely better, and I think the fact that they won't have that question to deal with. Is Jordan Love ready? I don't know. We've barely seen him. We've seen him a couple of times. And to be honest, that game against the Chiefs, the story became more about the fact that they sat his mom and his sister somewhere, that basically they would have had a better view from if they'd used the Hubble telescope. It was crazy. But we will see. I think that for the Packers, they are a football institution. I think they will be delighted that the focus is now going to be back on the team and performing as a team rather than their superstar back-to-back unhappy QB. It'll ultimately be Jordan Love who decides how far this team can go, because you can only scheme around a limited QB to a certain degree, even if your head coach is offensively minded and seems to be very smart. I don't know. Nobody knows what we're in for.
Conor, you touched on the NFC West episode around the job that's ahead of Sean McVay. I mean, is this where Matt LaFleur has to kind of earn his money in terms of taking Jordan under his wing and kind of, trying to take away the noise and the expectations and what will come with him being the starting quarterback this season for the Packers?
I think that's a really good point, Brian. And I think that's exactly it, right? This is where Matt LaFleur earns his stripes. Not that he hasn't earned them already, but people will say it's easy to do it when you've Aaron Rodgers to deliver on the field. You made the point about Watson's shaky start to last season, and I couldn't help thinking as you were saying it, maybe his transition would have been a little bit easier if Rodgers had bothered to attend the OTAs, which obviously he's happy to do now that he's a Jet and all is well with the world. All of that said, now I have to say, I can't believe these words are coming out of my mouth. I do actually sympathise with Rodgers' decision ultimately because of the lack of help that he got. I mean, the one time they decide to draft an offensive player in the first round, they draft Aaron Rodgers' replacement. Although Brian Goodcuss would probably tell you that got 2 seasons of MVP level play out of Aaron Rodgers, so it wasn't a completely wasted pick. Whatever way it turns out from here, it probably delivered a huge amount of value there. What did the Packers gain from keeping Rodgers on the roster last year? Probably only the solace in knowing that he wasn't going to win a Super Bowl somewhere else. So nobody will be rooting against him to a greater degree than Brian Gutekunst, hoping that he doesn't do it in New York. And whatever way that the Jordan Love season goes, that'll be the spectre that's hanging over them if he does start to cut a swathe through the AFC East and they start looking like likely contenders over in East Rutherford, New Jersey there. But sorry, specifically on what the Packers are going to do this season as opposed to what they could have done or where they would have been otherwise. Yeah, we haven't seen enough of Love to know. They look like they've got an exciting, core of young receivers there that could do something. LaFleur, as we know, can scheme anyone open. Like it's amazing sometimes what he can do with that offense. They've got the best one of the best offensive lines in the league, arguably. So it's not the worst situation for Love to be in. All things up, coach who very much the quarterback whisperer in the Kyle Shanahan mode. Good O-line, good protection in front of you. I don't think the wide receiver group necessarily bears comparison with the really elite units that are in the league, but it's absolutely serviceable. And this isn't the hardest division either. A lot will depend on what happens around you, whether the Vikings can sustain what they did last year. Spoiler alert, I don't think they can. Not so sure the Bears, as we've been saying, are going to be ultra competitive this year. Lions are the bookies' favourites to win the division. Lions and bookies' favourite isn't 3 words you've heard in a sentence for a long, long time. It's not insurmountable if he hits his straps early on, Love, and if that whole sitting him for 3 years and having him learn at the feet of the master, and jury's out on how good of a mentor Aaron Rodgers will necessarily have been. All QBs at that level are selfish and want to prolong their own careers to the greatest degree possible. They're not going to help their replacement through the door or let the ladder down for him. But in flashes that we've seen, small and short although they've been, he certainly doesn't look out of his depth. He looks poised. He can make the throws and he can make things happen. Let's see when we get a bigger sample size this year whether he can actually do it. But I'm not so sure I'd be too down on them, I have to say, which is big coming from me as a Bears fan, right?
Colin, last question on the Packers, and it's from a fan's perspective. What do you believe the expectations will be from the Packers fan group going into the season, bearing in mind how successful they've been in winning divisions, getting the championship games? And we've still, with all due respect, they've had some difficult losses over the years where they probably should have gone to the playoffs. Sorry, should have gone to the Super Bowl. And the Bucs game where, in particular, during COVID, where they lost that one and they were heavy favourites going into that game. Are we, because of the division, because of the nature of what the Vikings were like last year, and people still feel they're going to be a drop-off, the Lions are going to challenge, we're not sure where the Bears are at. Should the Packers fans be thinking there's still an opportunity to win the division with the players we have around us?
I mean, I suppose it has 2 sides to this. I think Packers fans in general will think that, and I think as fans you can understand why they would think that, right? Because given the history, the pedigree, and a lot of that, I suppose, is mystique in some ways, right? Because ultimately, it's very early on. They have success. They have a number of years in the wilderness, and then Reggie rolls into town. And we've had the good fortune, Brian, to talk to Wade Phillips, and Wade who's had the greats. I mean, look at who Wade has coached, and he basically told us that Reggie was the guy. He just couldn't believe the things Reggie was able to do on the field. And Reggie, funnily enough, is probably the guy who changed the trajectory. We always talk about the Packers and quarterbacks, and he's probably the one who changed and got them back on track, bringing him in. And ever since then, they've been there or thereabouts because of the QBs. I think they will have that expectation. It'll be a little bit like, Manchester United fans in the post-Ferguson era. It doesn't matter who is or who isn't there, or who isn't in charge. The expectation, whether it's real or not, but I think they will look around the division, and it's not like there's anyone towering over it. We'll get into the other teams, but there's nobody that you say, oh, this is not Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes lording it over the division.
I'll bring you, Colin, on to the next team, and I mean this in the nicest way. These are the darlings of the NFL right now, because everybody's in love with this Lions team. Haven't played a game yet, and yet they're the favourites for the division, first time in a long time, and everybody expects this Dan Campbell period to kind of continue in terms of, they were unfortunate not to make the playoffs last year. It's only going to improve, and I would say they have done some nice things in the off season, like they've corrected issues they had in the secondary. They brought in something from the Steelers. Mosley, he was with the 49ers. In the running game, David Montgomery's been brought in. Jamal Williams has moved on. But we had Adam Rank on, and he's a Bears fan, as you know, and he said, believe me, David Montgomery's a much better running back than Jamal Williams, and we'll see that come the start of the season. But I want to say, come the draft, a lot of people were questioning their draft picks. They felt they reached on both picks. Jamar Gibbs, running back, they obviously traded down from 6 originally because they wanted Witherspoon. They go at 12, they take the running back. And then at 18, they take Jack Campbell. And again, everybody felt it was a trade. Should we be in love with this Lions team, Colin, or are people kind of getting carried away because of how the season ended last year with a significant win? And is Goff the answer in the long term? Are they cementing him now as the quarterback, or is it still a wait-and-see scenario?
I get why people are, excited about the Lions. We've talked about it. I've described, Detroit as the factory of sadness, but it became the house of fun last year. And I think that's why people are excited about it. But, when you tell me about the players that have moved on, right? Jamal Williams had 17 touchdowns last year, okay? I mean, that puts him in an exalted company in terms of the people who've had in and around that. You're like the players who have more are the Dalian Tomlinson, Priest Holmes, Terrell Davis, Emmitt Smith, Earl Campbell, Marshall Falk, Adrian Peterson. That was an amazing season he had, and people might point to it as a fluke, as a one-off. Well, we'll have to wait and see on that, but it's going to be difficult to replace that. And they moved on from DeAndre Swift as well. So essentially 22 of their touchdowns from last year have moved on. I think it's going to be interesting because this is an off season where we've kind of seen the devaluation of the running back, right? It's kind of running back by committee now. You can bring guys in. I know Christian McCaffrey kind of has talked about that in recent weeks, about how he feels that teams are not appreciating how important particular running backs are, because guys are getting rewarded with contracts, and the Lions are going to be the team that maybe test this, because when you move on from 22 touchdowns, you're going to have to, it's going to be very interesting to see how the next set of guys get on. Goff is interesting because he's, I feel Jared Goff is a quarterback you can win with, but I don't think he's a quarterback you win because of, and I think that is the issue. You pay quarterbacks ultimately that you win because of. Quarterbacks you win with. I don't think you pay those guys what he is, getting. Now, they have a young team. They are building under Dan Campbell, and there will be the expectation that they do well, and how will they deal with that? But look, they are a team who certainly won't be afraid. They're taking a kind of a different approach to others by moving on from those running backs. They're showing that they are prepared. They believe in their system. They believe in Dan Campbell and what he is doing, and they think that he is the coach to take them places.
Connor, you touched on the good feeling earlier watching Hard Knocks with Dan Campbell and the fact they're favourites for the division. Are you buying into them? Do you think they're worthy favourites for the division?
Because it's this division, they probably are, to be fair to them. They look the best set to me. You know, I know we'll get to the Vikings shortly. I can see there being a big fall off there for a number of reasons. Yeah, a lot of questions over what they did in the draft, but they free agency moves that they made, I thought were smart. That looks like an elite secondary now. They really invested in the defensive backs, as you pointed out. That'll really help them. This was a top 5 offense last year as well. So yeah, absolutely agree with you, Colin. I think probably Goff is right at that point in the league that differentiates the guys between the guys you win with and the guys you win because of. Having said that, you know, if you put enough around them, Jeff Hostetler was a guy you could win with, and he won the Super Bowl. Nick Foles was a guy you could win with rather than because of, and he won the Super Bowl too. So every dog has its day. Goff has been within touch and distance before, and had a really good season last year. They go as far as he takes them, I think, ultimately, which, you know, admittedly is the most cliche thing you can probably say about any NFL team. Of course, they go as far as the quarterback takes them because he's the most important position on the field. But I see them make it the playoffs this year because, you know, let's face it, the competition around them in this division isn't what it is in some other divisions. And culture counts for a lot. Culture counts for a lot. Coaching counts for a lot. What we've seen in the insights that we've had into Detroit, courtesy of Hard Knocks, and the little glimpses that we get in those Dan Campbell press conferences where, you know, and even in that Jamal Williams, that brilliant interview after the Packers game last year where, you know, you go between the tears and the steel just like that at the snap of the fingers. You know, there is something exciting there and something special there. And yet people want to believe that it's real and that it can go to the next level. But it's going to be a fun watch this year.
We interviewed Scott Daly, the long snapper last offseason. Couldn't speak highly enough of Dan Campbell. And we recently interviewed Brock Wright, the tight end from the Lions. Again, similar sentiment. Love working for Dan Campbell. It looks like a team that's on the up. You touched on the Vikings. You both have, and the fact that the purple purgery and obviously the expectations coming off a season, which they had a good season. They win a division, you know, but there was a lot of games last year where people will look at it and say, how did they win that game? How did they beat the Bears when they were down by 2 touchdowns at home? How did they beat the Giants with that 60-yard field goal on Christmas Eve and then ultimately lost out to them in the playoffs? And there was other games at home. The Colts game, the week pre-Christmas, they're down, was it 36 points? It's a record return in terms of coming back. Like, there was so many games last year where they looked dead and buried, and yeah, Kevin O'Connell found a way to get this team over the line. People felt their luck ran out come the playoffs. Is that fair, Colin? Because what we recognized from the interview when we spoke to Kevin O'Connell last offseason was he sensed then he has a head coach with players will respect and love playing for, and that kind of turned out the way it did over the course of the season. And you saw it similar to the Lions, in which you saw some of the coverage after games in the locker room, and they were all so happy playing for him. But yet outside, no one really gave them the credit they deserved.
Yeah, I was hoping, David, you were going to go to Connor first, because I think this is the team where we might see the biggest kind of difference of opinion, because I'm not as down on the Vikings. A lot of people I know are, but as to the point that you're making, Brian, is why I believe in them. Ed Donatel was a disaster last year. Right, I had the good fortune of seeing the Vikings a few times last year, both on this side of the Atlantic and in the States. They were a shambles. I mean, the yards they gave up, the inability to cover wide receivers. It was incredible to watch what they were doing, and ultimately it eventually caught up to them because teams really wised up to it, and especially when you get to the playoffs. I think Brian Flores is a huge upgrade. I really do, and I think when their issue is they're going to be limited ultimately, I think, by Kirk Cousins. But again, Kirk Cousins is a quarterback you can win with. I don't think you win because of, but they have Justin Jefferson, who, you can make the arguments and you can put them in different ways, however way you want to rank. But the top 3 wide receivers are absolute superstars. To me, he is one of, if not the best wide receiver in the league. They've put another weapon alongside him. Obviously, Thielen has moved on, but Thielen, it was somewhat the law of diminishing returns last year. And I do think by bringing in Jordan Addison, that will complement Jefferson. I think this team could surprise people, because I think from what I'm seeing around the way people talk about the Vikings, and I get it, they won an awful lot of close games. I know Michael Lombardi is no fan of this team and thinks they will regress to the mean. And I understand that. Kevin O'Connell has coaching magic. I believe that, and I think Flores is an upgrade. I expect them to challenge for the division.
Connor, you're not sold on them, judging by your earlier comments.
No, not at all. I'm sorry. I'm going to agree with a lot of the individual points you're making, Colin, in fairness, but disagree with the overall conclusion. I think the Vikings are who they were in the playoffs last year. They were flat track bullies. They got lucky a couple of times, and once they got punched in the mouth, they couldn't get back up. And no disrespect, Brian, who did they get punched in the mouth by? The Giants. It's not even as if they went out to, one of the dominant teams in the NFC. Every time they were matched up against somebody who had game, they got curb stomped last year. The Cowboys ran all over them. The Packers handed it to them. The Eagles destroyed them. This is a team that won, and I know a lot has been made of this, and the statistic that jumps out. It's a team that won 13 games and still had a negative point differential. How do you win 13 games and still concede more points than you put up? I agree with you. Flores is a massive upgrade as defensive coordinator, but he's not got an awful lot to work with there. They're a talent-depleted unit. They lost to Darius Smith in the offseason as well. They go from maybe the second worst defense in the league statistically, and by the eye test, perhaps the worst defense in the league. Maybe they get to mid-table respectability, and perhaps that helps helps net out what I think will probably be regression to mean on the offensive side of the ball. Look at Justin Jefferson's season. Like, what an incredible year he had. Absolutely outstanding player. Side note here, we give Howie Roseman his props quite rightly, and often the Eagles GM famously passed on Justin Jefferson and took Jalen Reagor instead. What a mistake that was. You're looking at relying on Justin Jefferson to produce historically good seasons to sustain what they were able to do last year. I think they have a really good group there. It's not just all on him. I think an awful lot of things went right for them on that side of the ball. I don't think enough is going to go right on that side of the ball. I don't think they're going to get far enough, even with the injection of Flores on the other side. And I think they'll have better around them in the division, with the Lions and the Bears, who I mentioned earlier, handed them two victories last year. I think it's going to be harder for them. I don't think they're going to go as far as they did last year, and I think we're going to see a much more competitive division. I don't think they're going to have it all their own way the way they did last season.
I'll throw another one in there. I think one of the biggest concerns, we talk about their defense, I think their running game is a bit of a concern, because Madison, for me, is the one who's going to have to step up, because I think Dalvin Cook will be traded come the start of the season. There's so much talk over the course of the past month that the Dolphins were considering making a move. For me, it looks like he's open and available. If the right offer comes in, I'd suggest it'd be a kind of a July type of trade where someone goes down with an injury in camps that's a running back that someone expects to be playing. They make a move for Dalvin Cook. That's another thing. They weren't consistent within the run game last year. I think there's too many question marks for this team right now. But it will be interesting to see who's picking who come August and September. Colin, you want to close out this episode with a particular point?
I mean, I agree with Connor, like last year, flat track bullies, but that's why I think Flores is so important. Like, Flores is a 4-time Super Bowl winner, right? He was the play caller when the Patriots shut down the Rams completely, right? I mean, what a chess match that was. I mean, yeah, Belichick was there with him, but we saw when he went to Miami what he could do. Like, he's really creative. Like, his Dolphins defenses, blitz happy at times. He does so many interesting things. So the fact that he brings that experience, Ed Donatell, was like the kind of, take Simon and Garfunkel, right? Look at the talent disparity there. Ed Donatello was with Vic Fangio. And I have my issues with Vic, but ultimately Vic is clearly the brains and Ed Donatello was Pinky in that situation. So to me, to bring in Brian Flores and the experience that he brings as the head coach, the fact that he's going to change the mindset, because he's not going to accept purple purgatory. This is the guy who expects to win. I mean, there's a reason that despite the lawsuit, right, Mike Tomlin, and we will get to the Steelers when it comes to it. But I saw an amazing stat today over the past few years in terms of who has the most wins. It's like the Chiefs are ahead of everybody. Then you've got the Bills. Then you've got the Steelers. And that's the Steelers with like basically the corpse of Ben Roethlisberger and a hodgepodge of QBs. That's the Mike Tomlin effect. Mike Tomlin is a genius of a coach. Mike Tomlin recognized Brian Flores, brought him in despite everything that was going on with the league. That speaks volumes to me about the man. I think he will have a big impact. There's always a surprise team in the league who really, go against, I suppose, the off-season narrative. I think it could well be the Vikings.
In our NFC West episode, Connor proclaimed the 49ers the Mayo of the GAA, and the Vikings have been compared to Simon and Garfunkel on this episode. Our particular coaches have been compared to Simon and Garfunkel. That is our NFC North rundown of the off-season. Join us next time for our NFC East review.